It's 9 p.m. here in the French capital. You're watching live from Paris on France 24. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. These are the top stories. 3 days after the beheading of history teacher Samuel Paty in the Paris suburbs, the French police launch a series of raids targeting Islamist networks. More than 250,000 people across Europe have now lost their lives to COVID-19, and governments across the continent are taking urgent steps to contain a second wave. And following the victory of his leftist party in Bolivia's presidential election, the exiled former president Evo Morales indicates that he intends to return to his country. Welcome back. We begin here in Paris, where there's been a series of police operations today in connection with the killing of a teacher by a suspected Islamist. The teacher, Samuel Paty, was beheaded on Friday outside the school where he taught in a suburb 30 kilometers north of Paris. Well, his killing has sparked outrage here in France. It's understood that the motive for Paty's murder was that he showed cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad to his students as part of a debate about freedom of expression. Well, a number of Muslim parents then complained. Well, Paty's killer, an 18-year-old refugee from Chechnya, was himself shot and killed by the police on Friday. France 24's Mariel Sophos tells us more.
A surprise raid this Monday at the headquarters of this charity. The group organised an online fundraiser for the father of the pupil who made the complaint about murdered history teacher Samuel Paty. Uma Charity presents itself as a humanitarian organisation. These raids, which followed Sunday's Defence Council meeting, are part of Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin's political response. He announced mass probing of all NGOs suspected of wider links to radical Islamism.
About 50 organisations, 52 exactly, will be visited a number of times during this week by government services. Several of them, and I'm suggesting this because the President asked me to, will be dissolved by the Cabinet.
The Interior Minister also accuses the Organisation Against Islamophobia in France of links to the case, calling for it to be dissolved. Since this weekend, the organisation has strongly denied these accusations.
Since yesterday, the Organisation Against Islamophobia in France has been defamed several times and accused of a harassment campaign against Samuel Paty. This is not only false but deeply heinous. We are going to court. That's enough.
The Interior Minister also announced on Monday the arrest of several individuals linked to the attack, including 4 pupils who may have helped the killer identify Samuel Paty in return for payment. Later in the day, Prime Minister Jean Castex said that France would persevere in its fight against radical Islamism.
I want to tell you that under the authority of the President we are fighting, and will continue to do so with unwavering energy against Islamic radicalism.
Meanwhile, a campaign against online hate speech has been launched. 80 inquiries have been opened following messages supporting Paty's murder.
Well, teachers here in France have long complained of tensions surrounding religion and identity, which they say can spill over into the classroom. Well, as France 24's Fraser Jackson now explains, many are examining the role played by social media as a vehicle for hate speech in this shocking series of events.
In the days leading up to Friday's murder of Samuel Paty, posts and videos online called for his firing, giving his name and the school's address. These calls were echoed by a virtual mob of anonymous accounts, which could have influenced his attacker. The role of social media giants in terrorist acts is once again in the spotlight.
Depuis maintenant près de plus de 10 ans, on voit les actes terroristes diffusés au fur et à mesure sur les réseaux sociaux, et c'est là où ça devient très compliqué pour les victimes, parce qu'elles comprennent qu'il y a des appels à la haine. Ce qui est abominable, c'est que les réseaux sociaux continuent de diffuser cette information.
But whose job is it to watch what is being said and those saying it? Last June, French politician Laetitia Avia put forward a bill to demand that social media firms take more responsibility for what is published on their platforms and a framework to punish online hate speech. But it was struck down by France's highest court as infringing on freedom of expression. This lawyer believes that was a mistake. With it taking anywhere up to 6 months to ban an account spreading hate speech, she says a new law is desperately needed.
Aujourd'hui, la loi est tout à fait insuffisante. Elle n'est pas assez rapide. Il n'y a pas assez de responsabilités mises sur la tête des réseaux sociaux. Si vous voulez, aujourd'hui, il faut vraiment de gros moyens pour réellement les voir condamnés. Si jamais, d'eux-mêmes, ils décident de ne pas supprimer un contenu.
Over 80 investigations into hate speech have been launched since Friday's attack. The French government is holding meetings with social media firms in the coming days.
For more, we're joined now by terrorism and radicalization expert Bill Durodier. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Once again, France is in shock following a horrific crime committed by extremists on French soil. And many are asking, why does this keep happening? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think listening to your report just now, the two things I would pick up is that it focuses either on extremist radicals or on the role of social media. And whilst those two play a role in such incidents, I think that's to avoid the core of the argument. And the core of the argument is the ability as a culture, as a country, to defend the importance of freedom of expression. And free speech is precisely for those that we do not like, for people whose opinions we despise. And whilst it may indeed be uncomfortable sometimes to hear people saying things that offend us and that shock us, ultimately, as a society, we recognize that it's a small price to pay for the ability to be free. Now, it strikes me that it's a social problem that we're facing here, not just a security problem. It's France has lost its nerve, as has most other countries across the world, in its ability to argue for, articulate and defend the need to be free and for people to be able to say whatever they like. And if we've lost that at the level of society, then at the margins, we are always going to have incidents like this.
And in terms of trying to crack down on perpetrators, organizations, what do you make of the French authorities' attempts to identify radicalized individuals and groups? Because in American English, you might say it's a bit like a game of whack-a-mole, in that it's just a never-ending process that requires resources that basically no country has.
You're right. They are resources that no country has, because the problem is much deeper and more widespread than even the security services are prepared to admit and have resources for. The problem, as I mentioned earlier, is a social and cultural problem. If we don't win the whole of society to the desire to be free and therefore articulate ourselves freely with the pain that that may create, but whilst being free, then yes, we're going to be, spreading our resources in a way ineffectively. You can pretend that you can identify individuals through the means of security services. Well, it's not just a pretense, and it's a correct job and it needs to be done. But at the same time, the bigger discourse that has to be won is our ability to articulate and re-articulate at every level of society that we are a free society and that rests on free speech. And whilst we don't win that culture war, if you like, we will always be losing battles.
Yeah, indeed. If indeed the assailant of Friday's attack wasn't on any watch list, it suggests, doesn't it, that there are many people out there that perhaps would have or could have done what he did.
There are, but we shouldn't exaggerate the scale of the acute nature of this problem. What we should highlight, as I keep repeating, is the fact that most people in polite, liberal society are uncomfortable defending absolute freedom of expression. That's what Charlie Hebdo knew. That's what Charlie Hebdo was pointing towards. When it drew and published cartoons, it wasn't simply trying to say we should have no respect for any world religion. It wasn't just Islam that it would poke fun at. It was also Christianity, Judaism, or any other belief system that it thought was too powerful and needed to be put in its place. But it was also pointing to the inability of French intellectuals, French media, French dinner parties to argue for and defend free speech. If you think about it, 5 years ago, 4 million people marched behind the banner Je suis Charlie. And where are they now? We've got a few thousand teachers protesting in the streets because of the safety risks that they face. But all those people who said Je suis Charlie ran away. They all said Charlie Hebdo maybe goes a bit too far. And that's what Charlie Hebdo was pointing out. It was pointing out their hypocrisy, that they say we stand for free speech, but, whereas actually we should simply stand for free speech.
Okay, just lastly, we were talking about how social media plays a role and can play a role in radicalization. Could it therefore play a role in de-radicalizing people as well? Do you think perhaps social media is the vehicle perhaps to counter some of the hate speech, which is indeed doing the rounds on social media itself?
Well, not really, no. I think the role of social media is usually exaggerated at such times. The mainstream media remain the dominant information channels of society, whether it's television or newspapers. Social media tends to be parasitical upon those mainstream sources. And ultimately, if you want to de-radicalize people, you have to ask yourself the question, what it is that you want them to be de-radicalized to. And if you are unable as a society to win the argument as to why your values are worth buying into, why they are more important values, why, yes, freedom is an uncomfortable value to defend and articulate, but it has to be done again and again in every generation. Otherwise, we will lose our freedoms to all manner of laws and restrictions and terrorists. If we're unable to do that, then it is we as a mainstream society who are failing to provide the values that we want people to be de-radicalized to. The people we have problems with are looking for something to believe in and organizations to belong to. We're the ones failing to provide that.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Terrorism and radicalization expert Bill de Rodier, thank you so much. Staying here in France, around 20 million people here are affected by an overnight curfew which took effect on Saturday. In 9 cities across the country, including Paris and Marseille, residents must be in their homes by 9 p.m. The curfew then lasts until 6 a.m. every morning. Well, it's just been reported this evening as well that the First Lady here in France, Brigitte Macron, is going to have to self-isolate for 7 days after having come into contact with someone who has tested positive for COVID-19. It's understood that the First Lady is not displaying any symptoms of the virus. Governments across Europe have today taken urgent steps to try to slow the spread of this second wave of coronavirus infections, with Italy and Belgium being the latest to impose new measures, amongst them the closures of bars and restaurants. Well, earlier on today, the total number of Europeans to have died since the start of the pandemic reached a grim milestone. According to a tally compiled by AFP, more than 250,000 people across the continent have now lost their lives to COVID-19. France 24's Fraser Jackson has more.
As the second wave of coronavirus continues to wash over Europe, restrictions across the continent are tightening. Belgium is preparing for a difficult month ahead as the country braces for what the health minister called a tsunami of cases.
The figures that we see today are significantly higher than the ones that we saw back in March and April, when we took very restrictive measures.
The country has so far registered over 220,000 cases, a figure that has doubled in the past month. The number of people admitted to Belgian hospitals is currently doubling every week, prompting the government to act. People can now only meet with one person outside of their household, and a month-long curfew between midnight and 5 a.m. has been introduced, which sees bars and restaurants totally shut down. Slovenia has also announced an overnight curfew. On Monday, Ljubljana declared a 30-day state of emergency as it recorded a test positivity rate of over 20%. As part of the new restrictions, gathering limits will be brought down from 10 to 6. That announcement also introduced in Austria. People are limited to groups of 6 indoors and 12 outdoors, and the restriction applies to pretty much every environment, aside from people's houses. But Chancellor Kurz urged the public to exercise caution when hosting private gatherings. The strictest restrictions, however, were announced by Wales, which has introduced a 2-week firebreak lockdown after it recorded 4,000 new cases last week.
Everyone in Wales will be required to stay at home. All non-essential retail, leisure, hospitality and tourism businesses will close, just as they had to during the March lockdown.
The move was announced alongside an almost £300 million support package for businesses. The restrictions are currently set to end on the 9th of November.
Now, the exiled former president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, indicated today that he intends to return to his country following on from the sweeping victory of his leftist heir, Luis Arce. Well, Arce's win in this presidential election is not what many of the pollsters had forecast. Nevertheless, Bolivia's interim president, Janine Áñez, has congratulated her rival in the vote. Well, here's what the former president, Evo Morales, had to say at a press conference in Buenos Aires.
Hoy es un día histórico. Nuevamente el pueblo boliviano ha dado una lección de democracia y de perseverancia. El pueblo ha logrado resistir al golpe de Estado, a un gobierno de facto, 2 masacres, una administración de la pandemia marcada por la ineficiencia y la corrupción, varias postergaciones de las elecciones y la peor crisis económica de nuestra historia.
Okay, Evo Morales speaking from Buenos Aires. Well, let's speak to our regional correspondent, Declan McGarvey, who also joins us from the Argentine capital. Let's, of course, keep our focus very much on Bolivia. And if you could just bring us up to speed on the latest from that election, if you would.
So right now, just under 20% of vote counting has been completed. This has been a very slow vote count, but it does indicate a clear victory for Luis Arce, the Movement to Socialism candidate, who is at the moment on approximately 52% of the vote, with his conservative opposition candidate, Carlos Mesa, on around 31% of the vote. That would point to a clear margin of victory for Luis Arce and a plus 10% margin of victory required under Bolivian electoral law to win a first round in this election. It would seem then that Luis Arce will be the next president of Bolivia.
Yeah, and just before we crossed you, we were listening to the former president, Evo Morales, speaking there, calling this a historic day. Obviously, he's pleased, talking about perhaps coming back to Bolivia at this stage. I mean, do you think, therefore, that Arce is going to be taking his cues from Morales once he's in office?
Well, that's the big question doing the rounds at the moment. It's important to say, first of all, that Luis Arce is a political figure in his own right. He was the chief architect of the economic boom in Bolivia earlier this century that saw record levels of economic growth, lifted millions out of poverty prior to the more controversial later stages of the Evo Morales government. That said, in this election campaign, he was handpicked by Evo Morales to lead his party's candidacy. Evo Morales is his main political backer, and Evo Morales is the biggest political player in Bolivian politics. He ruled Bolivia from 2006 to 2019. He was the country's first indigenous president. He remains extremely popular, despite a controversial end to his government last year, which ended with a disputed and ultimately annulled election, which saw Morales forced into exile in Argentina after an intervention by the country's military. Now, if Morales is able to puppeteer the Arce government from the backstage, it would be a political comeback of stunning proportions for Evo Morales, who has been forced into exile in a neighboring country and is currently subject to an arrest warrant by the Bolivian judiciary on numerous charges ranging from corruption to sedition and terrorism in the wake of those violent disturbances last year as a result of that annulled election, as well as sex trafficking and of sexual relations with a minor, all of which Evo Morales denies, but they could complicate his own political comeback, either backstage or a possible return to his Bolivian homeland.
Okay, France 24's regional correspondent Declan McGarvey, thank you very much indeed for bringing us up to speed.